Hey everyone, Bearwire here for runatonce.com. Today I found some old footage. A couple months ago I played a 1020 Zoom session. From looking through it briefly, I believe big majority of hands here are against Makoma 1, who I don't think I've covered recently. Definitely a strong player who's been around for as long as I've been around, at least, I believe. I've played games with him for as much of my career as I can remember, and I think that his game has changed along with kind of the general scope of Heads Up. So we should see some pretty difficult spots. I would say that he's playing like a lot of the toughest players in the world are, but maybe doesn't get that kind of recognition. So I just wanted to point out that that's kind of the level of thought that I'll give to the hands against him. This player on the other table I don't recognize. I think he was an amateur player in the pool. And yeah, I mean, given that this was a couple months ago, I'm going to be going through this as kind of a first impression review. Should be at least 2 parts, maybe 3, if we get the depth of discussion that I'm expecting. So I'll just get started. I think this is the beginning, or very close to the beginning of the session here. And we can see that it looks like there was maybe a showdown just before this video started. And I think I actually remember this hand. My recollection is villain 3-betting pre-flop. But presumably not very big if I was calling a7 offsuit. Or there's a small chance that I 4-bet him and he flatted. And I think he was more than willing. I'm pretty sure this was a 3-bet pot. Villain c-bets flop and then check calls either turn or river. But I'm pretty sure it was river. So we get the early impression that he's c-betting wide in good c-bet situations, and also that he's willing to call with kind of the perceived top of his range in a weak spot. I like to go through that stuff even with people who I perceive to be amateur players, because I know that the average amateur player in today's games is pretty well aware of poker strategy and maybe is using an outdated or misguided application of poker strategy, but they're not. Oh, maybe I got mixed up. It looks like there's two players in the pool. This GA207 might have been the amateur I was thinking of. So that 8 deuce suited hand on table 1 I think was pretty standard. Bad open-ender, leading out for 2 streets to represent King X, and certainly a hand that I'm going to tend to fire on the river, just because it's so low. Probably the exact bottom of my range. Yeah, so this GA207 player, he may be the amateur I was thinking of, because we see when we check behind here on the flop, he min bets the turn. This probably looks like just a crappy hand that should maybe get folded, but given the price and the fact that I think there's some implied odds for my 6 outs, I think that we should be peeling hands like this. I would fold some very poor trash if I had like 10-6 or something. But I think that having 2 extremely likely clean overcards, just applying the assumption that his min bet is going to tend to be weak value bets, sometimes bluffs. Very unlikely that he has a hand like ace-x or better. So with that assumption in place, I should have 6 clean outs. And some implied odds for like when he check calls the river, and because the flush draw misses. Table 1 against Makoma, I c-bet and double barrel with 6-7. Pretty straightforward bluffing hand on this texture. I do get to barrel some hands weaker than ace-x for sure with the sizing line that I'm choosing here. So at the very least, I'm going to barrel my good gut shots to the nuts. Some bluffing hands as well, like 9-7 or 10-9. Type combos are pretty nice as well. So when the river is a 6, I think it can be good against like king high flush draws or pocket 3s. hands like that. Maybe like a king 4 type hand. So I think it's a pretty clear check on the river. I can bluff with those 10-9s or 9-7s. So I end up not bluffing the river. This is kind of like this situation on table 2. I mean, it's a couple things. When he checks on the river, like I described, I was kind of peeling for implied odds, because I think that those weak value bets will tend to check call the river. Like flush draw misses, there's not much to be scared of on this board. I think if he checks and I bet even as big as like pot or something, a hand like 5x, pocket 4s, those hands are going to tend to look you up. So, but another reason that I take the showdown here is just to gain information on a readless situation. I think it could be an acceptable bluff. Like I could probably pull it off against the parts of his range that are just like similar trash, and we kind of confirm that by seeing that he had Jack 9 as a bluff on the turn. It would be a shame to lose to Queen 4 on the river or Queen Jack or something like that, which are certainly part of an amateur player's range. But I gain that information there, see that I should continue to make my light calls, probably make some light raises in the future, and read bigger bets, presumably to be a bit stronger, a bit more polarized. So, unfortunate run out for the king 5 after we turn such a strong hand. I don't think we have any option but to check the river, and it was probably going to be a check call against most bet sizes. This hand on table 2, I think I should probably just c-bet the flop. It's like a pretty good c-bet in a vacuum, and at this stage I kind of want to get a feel for if this player is just going to let me run him over. I do decide to run the delayed bluff when I get like a pretty sweet opportunity for the delayed bluff, and that one works, so I end up gaining some good information there, and I end up winning the pot. But I think that could have been executed better. So on table 1, I'm using a larger delayed c-bet size, which I think I've explained in other spots, but basically I think on textures like this where there's pretty high quality hands that want to delayed c-bet, like a weak to medium ace like I have, or like turn 2 pair or turn sets. But then there's also like pretty marginal hands that might want to get some protection here. For example, if I don't bet the flop with like deuce X or pocket 5s, or if I turn an 8, those hands might be interested in getting protection against queen 9, and similar hand classes that won't lead the turn. So I think that there's a good application of two bet sizes here, and ace 5 typically goes into the larger one for me. So when I face this really big check raise, I'm in kind of an interesting spot. I don't know if Makoma is aware that I'm using two sizes here, but the fact that I used the bigger one and still got check raised means that his play in a vacuum is a lot stronger than had I chosen the smaller size. So having this class of hand when I pick the bigger size, I'm not thrilled about facing the check raise, especially such a large one. One of the things that I think makes him pretty tough is that he utilizes sizes that attack for stacks in a lot of situations that call for it. So here he's pretty clearly representing a set of hands like ace 8, pocket 2s, pocket 8s for value. Basically hands that are more than willing to put all of the money in. King 8 might be the most marginal hand that I expect him to take this sizing choice with, because it's pretty obviously trying to set up the remainder of stacks, I think. So in this case, I have a weak ace, which is one of the weaker hands that wants to go big on the turn. I might use some like medium to strong kings as well, and those hands I'm probably going to bet fold to the check raise. So when I peel the turn with my ace and I have a low kicker that's also a spade kicker, I think I'm in the in a category of value bets that doesn't really need to defend this river. So the question just ends up being like exploitatively, do I think that I have a reason to call this river? I don't think I ended up calling here because, well, a few reasons. I didn't have any particular read in either direction. Yeah, I did fold fairly fast, actually. I don't have a read in either direction. For that situation, I certainly don't think that it's a mandatory call in my range. But I think that some similar hands are going to want to consider river call. If I unblock the flush draws that are a little more willing to use that sizing plan, then I would more seriously consider the river call. Just want to verify what happened in this Jack-10 hand. I think I go for a large c-bet. This is kind of an exploitative sizing strategy that I might go for in a situation where I think an amateur will be kind of indifferent to my bet size when he has what I want him to have. So, of course, what I want him to have is an ace, and I want to get paid fairly big across multiple streets on a drawy texture. But unfortunately, the 4 hearts come. It's not going to stop me from calling a min bet on the river, though. I think you should call anything there, basically. Anything that's anything. Suppose I do have I guess it's worth pointing out, I do have the option to raise as well on the river. But again, at this point, I'm kind of feeling out my opponent for what he's going to show me when he uses this size. So far, all I've seen is an airball. So I don't have that much incentive to take a reasonably showdownable hand and turn it into a bluff at this stage in the match. I'd rather continue to gain information by calling hands that seem pretty clear that they can call profitably. So I use a small c-bet size on table 1, which I'm using on the majority of board textures these days. So long as my opponent shouldn't have a very tough time defending, I think that the small c-bet allows me to keep my frequency up and allows me to distribute my range in a way that's a little bit closer to PO Solver recommended. So in knowing that I've chosen that sizing and knowing that my range is a little bit better distributed, when I have kind of a slam dunk bluff hand like this one, I don't need to feel, I guess, shy about going ahead and taking an aggressive line. This is a situation where I can absolutely have a chunk of 8x. I think my sizing line is appropriate for 8x, and I think on this run out, like my hand on the turn and my hand on the river, I think is just like a really clear top quality bluff. So I'm choosing a sizing line that maps to my like strong 8s, my flushes, things of that rough hand class. Weak flushes, I guess. I think if we had the nut flush, we might want to pick overbet. Or like a big flush, we might want to pick overbet. But I think that sizing maps to like the middle of my value range. We could bet the turn with the King 7, but I tend to use smaller sizes on this board texture to allow myself to bet more protection hands. So King 7 is a bit strong when I'm using a small sizing. I typically go for the check, but I think betting is okay against some people. River just, I don't know, I think a pretty clear value bet. So it's worth looking at, what I'm doing against this player here. I've seen numerous times at this stage in the match that GA is willing to small bet, and I know that he's willing to small bet with some pure air. So my choice to check behind the flop, I think, is a bad one. I think this is just like a lack of focus from me, and if I was paying closer attention to the dynamic of this matchup, I would recognize that any hand that can't defend against 1/5 pot on the turn, which of course my hand cannot, should really be thinking about bluffing the flop so that I don't get blown off of my range at a high frequency. That's certainly more of an adjustment for an amateur matchup, but a pretty important one, I think. So I'm disappointed to see myself getting a little run over there. Great flop for me, and he leads. It's kind of an interesting situation when he's led turn a lot, but he hasn't led flop. I do decide to just fast play, and I go for a small sizing, which I'm pretty okay with. We do block a lot of stuff, but it's really more just about building a pot with uncertainty. I think building a pot with your strongest hands against someone who you don't know a lot about is just the way to go from the start. King 6, not a strong part of my... I mean, it's basically my worst king getting to the turn because I don't have a gutter. So, very reasonable to me to check behind twice. I have an opportunity to consider raising river with a hand like that, but again, it feels very high in my range to be utilizing that kind of play. I think it could pretty easily just be a successful call. And noteworthy that Makoma checked the turn here with King 3. I would suspect that he was planning on repeating the sizing line that he took about 5 minutes ago when I had my ace 5. I think it ends up being a very appropriate hand class on a very similar board texture. So I think he was probably looking to take advantage of the dynamic that he's already created. I think a lot of players do that, and even very good ones, and that's a fine hand choice for check raising turn, so I'm not going to criticize it, but I do think that in general, players are a little bit too likely to repeat lines that have been used in recent history, even when they're suboptimal for their hand. And I think that's just part of like the psychology of poker, and it's important not to get too caught up in that, in my opinion. I think people very, very often will not so much turn their hand face up, but they'll reveal their intentions by trying to duplicate lines and repeat lines over and over when they could just be utilizing more accurate lines to their unique situation. I decided not to c-bet the 9-8, which, with a heart in my hand, I think I should probably just tend to c-bet. Definitely one of my weakest hands on the texture. I usually flop a gutter or a pair with my 3-bet range, so probably not like an overall range problem to be check folding that hand. I don't think it's going to have my check folding frequency be very high, but it's a close candidate for bluffing, I would say, in my overall range. So, interesting spot for this 3-bet pot. Ace-10 offsuit. When Makoma 3-bet's really big, I could consider 4-betting or flatting. I think that my hand is just outside of the range that thinks about folding. So I guess near the bottom of the range that continues to such a large 3-bet. But the choice to call is obviously fine. The flop decision, when he bets 1/4 pot, I think he's making the claim that I'm seeing his entire or close to his entire range bet for this size. So my response should include a fair bit of raising. I think raising with some protection hands is appropriate, especially if I don't expect to get 3-bet on the flop. And given how it's not super easy for me to have 10x when he 3-bets really big, but I think a lot of people are still perceived to have like all their 10-9 through ace-10 offsuit hands. Some people do have all those hands. I think it's a bit loose to continue them all to such a big 3-bet. But I think that I'm perceived to have a good distribution of 10x on this board, so I get to make this small raise and not get 3-bet very aggressively, I would say. With my strongest 10, I think it's a pretty categorically easy hand to include in my raising range for value. But I'm only pointing out the small-ish sizing to indicate that my overall range here is going to be of somewhat high frequency, including some like nut flush draw type hands to get it in, some like 5x, pocket 6s, pocket 7s kind of hands to get protection and value. And then a reasonable distribution of bluffs. I don't get to bluff like a ton, but I'm going to be interested in bluffing some hands with backdoor potential and some hands that remove his floats, as is often my kind of top choice for distributing bluffs on the flop. Not so much looking to bluff hands that have heaps of equity, but again, I don't really expect him to 3-bet me on the flop, so I think that raising some flush draws or some like strong backdoor draws is totally acceptable, because I don't expect to lose out on realizing equity. I think I'll be able to realize equity after raising. So obviously an amazing flop on the right. I'm going to do a lot of checking on this board in general, but against an amateur player I might look to overbluff a little bit, because a lot of 2 overcard hands that are just in pre-flop ranges that don't hit this flop. And when I have a hand like this one that's like super strong but not totally protected, because it's not the nut flush or the second nut flush, I'm going to tend to value bet hands of that class. So like low to medium flushes, probably sets and straights. Those are hands that I'm going to tend to bet on the flop. Don't recall what he had in that showdown. Not sure if I look it up because I'm in the middle of this hand on table 1 that I'll give a second look as well. Makoma uses a small c-bet. I haven't quite nailed down a pattern to his c-bet sizings, at least I don't remember one, but I know he utilizes a few different c-bet sizings. And he checks behind the queen turn, which I think it doesn't necessarily cap his range in the strictest sense, but because I think that he recognizes that like a lot of bluffing hands have to categorically slow down in this situation. The number of combinations that he represents get cut down very quickly on a card like this one, so his number of potential bluffs has to go down as well. So I do think we're going to see some barreling from him on a card like this, but usually like nothing crazy, nothing huge, and I wouldn't be shocked to see his checking range include a fair number of traps. So when I check again on the river, and he uses this like big bet size, I think that he recognizes that this is a situation where I would tend to just lead out with Queen X. And I also think he recognizes that by not having Ace King, it's kind of difficult for me to check raise here. So I like the sizing that he chose. It's also like, because of the fact that he bets so small on the flop, not a lot of money has gone in, so my range is still reasonably wide. And he could pretty reasonably think that a hand like Pocket Kings could bet this size for value. Ace Jack, King Jack, things of that nature. So that's kind of where my head was at. I wasn't totally convinced that he would be so creative with his bet sizing with an airball here, but there's always the risk that he just has a hand that looks appropriate for overbetting. For example, like King 5 of spades or something. Kind of strong, doesn't feel great about betting small, but maybe wants to utilize the king blocker, so that I don't have my like King 9 check raise hands, or King 9 traps, whatever. I guess King Jack as well, he blocks. King 10, those are pretty strong hands that might bluff catch here. So I mean, I have a legitimate spot. I think I'm supposed to be calling, generally speaking. I'm not thrilled to see myself fold so quickly. So that to me indicates that I either had like a sense that he just systematically bluffs a little bit too, or he underbluffs a little bit for that kind of sizing in like a unique spot. But I don't feel extremely confident in saying that. So I think that like the strength of hand that I'm willing to fold should, like, I guess what I'm saying is the amount of exploitability that I'm willing to open myself up to should kind of be proportional to my confidence about my read. So I don't like to go I don't like to be somewhat confident about a read and then go to a 0 or 100% strategy. I like to kind of adjust my defense frequencies or my bluffing frequencies or my raising frequencies incrementally according to how confident I am. So my confidence in the match, I guess, was higher than it is at the moment, 2 months later, 3 months later, whatever it is. Pretty small river bet from Makoma after. So this was on table 2, this was a small flop c-bet. And then I chose to check behind the turn. This is a type of hand that I like to protect my check back range with, because it's not too weak to put in a turn bet that I like to, like the turn bet size that I like to use, but it's extremely marginal. And when a hand becomes kind of marginal for the turn bet size that I like to use most often, then I'm going to consider shifting it into other ranges to strengthen those ranges. So I think my hand is too strong to check behind the flop. I have great backdoor potential, so I want to potentially realize that in a larger pot. But when it totally bricks on the turn and I have a lot of checkbacks, a lot of like 9x or pocket pairs or queen x, then it's not bad to include some aces as well that didn't improve and like don't have an amazing kicker. So that's what I did here. But when I face this small river bet, I'm just kind of inclined to think that I'm not getting enough value. If he was to check the river to me, for example, I would generally opt for like a small overbet here, or just like a pretty big sizing, because when the spade comes, I'm not really going to value bet the river so much with like, well, there's just not as many like 3/4 pot hands that I'm interested in using. I might want to use a small sizing like he did if I have like pocket 10s or like king 9. I might want to use a small overbet sizing if I have like ace x or king queen. So this bet size puts me in a weird spot. I think I can be pretty confident that his range includes like weaker aces, some strong queens, but I have no idea how often he's using this as like an inducing bet with a stronger hand. Because I don't have much information, I'm probably gonna, and I'm gonna get back to table 1 after I let this one play out. So I do end up going for the raise, and I just kind of choose a size that matches pretty closely to the size I would have bet against a check. It's not a perfect strategy, because him taking the lead, in theory, should put his range in like a stronger category and make defense a little bit different. So, some of the hands that would check fold to 240 on the river are weaker than some of the hands that bet fold to 240. So it's not a perfect choice, but it just kind of matches my confidence, I guess, about how often he's going to utilize that bet size with a hand better than ace 8. And I'm severely under-repped here on the turn when I go check. So I generally feel pretty good about this. This is not necessarily a line I'm going to continue to feel great about now that it's been introduced. Kind of like what I was talking about earlier in the video. The dynamics that end up evolving out of situations like this are not to be overlooked. I think people keep that on the front of their mind when they're coming up with their lines, and don't necessarily always take the optimal sizing choice. So it wouldn't shock me to see Makoma start over-representing traps in his small bet range in spots like this, so that he can start utilizing like a bet 3-bet strategy, or like, putting in river shoves after I raise rather than going ahead and overbetting himself. So I think that would be an extreme adjustment, not necessarily one that I would use right away, but I still think that that's how a lot of players react to situations like this. So this king-queen hand on the first table was just a c-bet in a single raise pot. I think a very reasonable hand to just try and win the pot with on the flop. And when I get check min raised, I think I just have too much equity to give up my hand. Again, I'm very often going to have 6 clean outs. It's not that different from the small betting situation against Jack 10, from earlier. The big difference here comes on the turn. I do turn one of my 6 outs, but I face now like a 3/4 pot bet, and I'm starting to feel a lot less happy about this hand. After this player has introduced, a lot of min betting and on the flop just min raising, he hasn't really used his slider yet. So to start using the bet slider, something's unique about this. Something's different about this hand. So that's definitely worth recognizing. It's also worth thinking about, has his mental state changed? So it's worth looking at his stack to see if some other players have like won pots from him recently. And it doesn't really seem to be the case. He might be $200-300 lower than he was before. But I don't have any strong evidence that his mental state has changed. So not super thrilled. The 6, on the other hand, is a great river for me. Spades miss. Potentially some like 2-pair hands get counterfeit. So I do feel, and when that happens, facing a check is a nice additional piece of evidence, because if he was raising light with like 6-5 or 7-6, which is still a possibility up to this point, checking the river should, for all intents and purposes, remove those hands from his range. So even though I was kind of intimidated by his turn bet, I now feel pretty good about potentially value betting. I could see him having 4x of spades, 4-3, queen 4, queen 3. Keep in mind that the min raise was on the flop, right? So I go for a pretty small bet, which I'm not. I think I should be betting bigger here, because I think with all those hands, and we see me pulling up that previous hand against Makoma, I guess he just suspected that I would be over bluffing the line that I took, trying to represent something like spades or river 2-pair, and not necessarily considering that I would have hands like ace-x in my range. So that's pretty nice that I was able to expand my value range in that situation and get a light call because of it, because I think that's one of the weakest hands he would bet river with. But going back to this hand on table 1, I think my small bet might be a mistake, because what I'm really hoping is happening on the river is, and I block the queen of spades, so it's not great. It would be great if he could have like queen x of spades. That would make perfect sense to check call the river. But also 4x of spades I think is a possibility, 4-3 like I said, or queen 3 and queen 4, because his check raise on the flop was a min raise, but his turn bet was quite big. So to me that indicates that his flop range could have been very wide and mergey, but his turn range was definitely polar, or far more likely to be polar. So I think a lot of the hands I'm hoping to get calls from on the river are previously strong looking hands. And when I bet small, all that does is it hopes to induce maybe from like an ace-5 of spades kind of hand and just hope that he punts it. But I think a more realistic result is that he has 4-3 or queen 4 or something, and just kind of makes a frustrated check call on the river because the spades missed. Even 4x of spades might decide to call the river just out of frustration. So I think I should be betting bigger in that river spot. Pretty big check raise from Makoma on 10-5-3. I went for the bigger c-bet size, and I think I should keep in mind that his check raise frequency seems, I don't want to say indifferent to sizing, but he's willing to be aggressive on flops and on turns even against my bigger bets. So it's not only when I utilize small c-bets and small delayed c-bets that I'm seeing check raise aggression. So I want to keep that in mind when I'm building my ranges. I want to make sure I don't over bluff those bigger bets, because if I'm facing frequent check raises against the bigger bet and I'm over bluffing, then I'm handing him pretty large amounts of money early in the hand. So I did decide to check raise the 10 deuce flop with queen 10. I think that's just standard. I mean, I don't necessarily want a super wide check raise frequency because the deuce is what's paired. So I don't have a whole lot of deuces in my pre-flop range, but when he's going 1/4 and it's like rainbow board, 10 deuce deuce, no draws at all, I think that he's very willing to get out of line with frequency. So I feel pretty comfortable using like a modest check raise size and going kind of wide. So my value range, yeah, I'm not going to have a ton of deuce X hands, but I'm going to make sure that a lot of them are in this range. And this way I get to take advantage of what I would like to do with a chunk of 10x and like medium to small pocket pairs. Even some hands like ace 9 or ace jack, if I flatted pre, are totally reasonable hands to include in this check raising range. As kind of like my value range, I guess you would call it. So the way this is shaped up so far, I'm going to expect 3 parts out of this video. We're getting towards the 1/3 mark in a few minutes. Pocket 4s, I think, could be a small c-bet on the flop, but it's possible that at this stage I'm a little shy against his check raise frequency. He's shown a pretty high check raise frequency, and that lines up with what I remember of his game in the past. Very willing to be aggressive early in the hand. But here I do work this hand into my turn range, and I think it just makes a lot of sense for this turn situation. Again, it's the spot where I'm splitting sizings, and 4s fits very well into the small sizing range that I want to use on textures like that. It also works quite nicely for hands that don't bluff catch well on the river. So I end up getting the kind of appropriate amount of money in against hands that I want to get that money in against, rather than making a pretty low quality call on the river or potentially folding the best hand on the river. So as I said, I do think we end up being the only 2 players. I'm playing pretty fast today for whatever reason. Quick check call for me on the right table, and after a 1/4, I think I just have a very clear hand to attempt to show down. It's even potentially a hand. Yeah, I kind of got the feeling I was going to face a bet like this. I'm not in a lovely spot here on the river. Given the small flop bet and the relatively, I don't want to say narrow set of hands that's interested in betting the river, but on a run out like this where it pairs and a lot of kickers get negated, I think perceived ranges include some amount of checking on my end for ace X. I think that would probably be a mistake just because so little money has gone in so far. But I do have the opportunity to like check raise hands like ace 5, or even probably check raise hands like ace 3 or ace 4 as just kind of like a free roll. But I also generally want to just put in like a modest bet size, I think, for my ace X hands. So when I check, I think I'm perceived to be kind of 9x and lower, some like 5-4 kind of hands, a lot of pocket pairs and king highs, and when I get into like the queen jack high area, some of those hands are going to want to bluff, some of those hands are probably still going to check, and king high is just very heavily represented in this range, so I don't think this is a spot where I can treat all of my king high equal. I think some of my king highs are supposed to check call against this sizing line. And king 8, king 10, king jack, those are likely high enough. Oh, I ended up check calling. So I actually thought I folded. But yeah, I think that part of my range is a theoretical call. So if I believe that he's bluffing sufficiently, recognizing that spot, then it's a very reasonable choice. It's also noteworthy that he went 2/3 there, which maps to the 9x. In a similar but not super similar spot earlier, queen jack 10, he went 2x pot on the river. But that could very well have been the dynamic of having ace king and me not having ace king. This hand on table 1 is a fun spot. I think boards that are mostly chops are very interesting to look at. because the risk reward is shifted in a way that I think a lot of people don't recognize. Of course, when I have a bluff catcher like this, I am supposed to be treating this situation, I mean, I don't want to say the same, but essentially in the same theoretical way that you would treat any bluff catching spot. You want to defend sometimes according to the risk reward. But in this case, the pot odds are deceptive because he's risking 200 to win 100, but that's when I fold, he wins the 100. If I call the 200, each of us only stands to win 50. So his risk here lines up with kind of the usual risk reward for bluffing, but my defense risk here is skewed, I guess, to 1/2 of the reward that it would normally be getting. So when I'm right here, I don't win 100, I win 50. So I'm treating this bet size, from my point of view, as a 4x pot rather than 2x pot, which is, well, yeah, it's not an ideal scenario. And, you know, you want to think about, I guess, this is like a bluff catching decision that doesn't necessarily have like clear advantages to certain hands or disadvantages to certain hands. Because if he had a flush on the turn, I don't know anything about how he categorically decides whether he's going to check or bet with like a queen or a 9 or a 10 on the turn. And of course, those are the only relevant cards. So I can't really block what I want to block other than by just having like 2 fairly large cards. If he's going to have a 9 of spades or a 10 of spades, he's usually not going to have like a dangler 4, right? Because those are hands that wouldn't defend pre-flop. So most of his 9 of spades, 10 of spades, and queen of spades hands are going to come along with a card that's 6 or higher, roughly. So I can make a slight adjustment there by just tending to call bigger cards, and that's certainly something. I mean, when I'm treating it kind of like a 4x pot risk reward, I feel reasonably comfortable with the idea that, well, I mean, my odds are just not very good here, but so far as allowing him to bluff, my defense requirements don't necessarily change. It's actually a very interesting mathematical spot, and I'd be happy if anyone who's kind of done like the grunt work on the matter would be willing to open up like a discussion in the comments, because I think this is, I mean, it's outside the scope of the video as we wrap up this part, but I think the written version of this kind of situation would be a little more helpful. So if anyone is willing to start that discussion in the comments, I'd be happy to kind of fill in the gaps or contribute to that. But the general idea stands that I think split pots are very interesting because my pot odds as in terms of making a successful call are weighed twice as poorly as they usually would be, whereas my opponent's success on bluff math does not actually change in this situation. And of course the same thing happens if he were to check to me. There's no advantage to being the out of position player here. It's just the way that things change when you're the aggressor, and all bluff catchers, or effectively all bluff catchers, are splits. Of course, there's a small chance that I have the 9 of spades or 10 of spades myself. So, yeah, I think with that hand, I'm going to wrap up this part. Certainly some interesting spots, and hopefully some good discussion on a tough opponent. So I'll be back with part 2 for the next video, and good luck to everyone. I'll see you next time.